All right, here we are with A Lesson Before Writing, Episode 9. I'm one of your co hosts, Ted Morrissey, and I'm here with Grant Tracy. And this is Grant's most recent book, Neon Kiss, now out in paperback. Besides the terrific introduction that Grant wrote for the hardcover edition, it also has a preview of the next Hayden Fuller novel, A Shoeshine Kill. Grant and Jeremy Schraffenberger did a reading together just a week ago or so. And Grant read from this, and Jeremy J.D. Schraffenberger read from his new chapbook. And I uploaded that as bonus episode 1 of our podcast. So check that out as well. And I'm also here with Brady Harrison, most recent book, The Term Between, which won the High Plains Book Award. That's why it's got that little thing on it. But Brady, I also finally got more copies of your hardcover edition. As you know, I was out of them because I had sent a bunch of copies out for review and for contests. And then when you were in Ireland, you wanted my entire stock of your books sent to you in Ireland. So I sent them there. And then I just, kind of didn't get around to getting any more copies of the hardcover, but I really wanted to have some on hand. So I got a hold of it. So I've got your hardcover edition. If you've been to our website recently, I've posted a little thing there. We don't charge anything for people to listen to us and watch our podcasts, and I'm perfectly cool with that, and I plan to keep it that way. But it would be nice every once in a while if people kind of appreciate what we're up to. Maybe they could think about buying one of our books, and particularly one of our hardcover books, and maybe donating it to their local library after they get done enjoying it themselves. What a lot of people don't realize, the only reason I know it is because I've also been a librarian for 25 years, is that it's really hard to get libraries to buy copies of your books when they come out. I don't mean you guys' books, I mean anybody's book. Because shelf space is very limited, libraries have limited budgets, and because of interlibrary loan systems being so efficient, what most librarians do, and by most I mean probably all of them, each week or however frequently they do acquisitions, they kind of look, and of course they buy the newest 5 James Patterson books, and they get Danielle Steele, and they get David Baldacci, and they get all those kind of names. But if there's a book that looks interesting but it's by an author that they don't really know, they generally decide, okay, I'm not gonna buy that because no one's gonna come in asking for it. And if they do, we can find it maybe at another library. Like our library is part of a 500 library consortium across the state of Illinois. So there's a lot of books in the consortium. So a lot of librarians only buy a book if maybe another library somewhere in the state doesn't have it. And what I run into a lot as a reader is that I'll read a review like in the New York Times or whatever of a brand new book that's out, and I'll think it sounds really cool. And so I'll immediately I'll just pick my phone up and I'll go to order it from my local library branch, and I'll discover there's maybe 1 or 2 copies in the entire state. And so I'll request it, but then it's like months and months and months before it arrives. I think what happens is there's 6 of us in the state of Illinois who read the same review, and we all immediately go and request it. And then we've got to wait for this 1 copy to circulate around the state. So anyway, the point here is it's really kind of a catch-22 because no one comes in asking for books by unknown writers, but the main reason they're unknown is because they aren't in libraries. And, so anyway, if people would like to buy a copy and read it and donate it to their local library, that'd be great. My big news, as I keep yammering on here, is I've got a new book out of my own, a novel, The Strophes of Job, and it's actually a prequel to my book, Crow's Song for the Stricken, which came out in 2017 and did pretty well. So I've been working on this for about 6 years now. People I don't think realize how long it can take to write a book, even though it's not very thick. I've sure spent a lot of time on it, but I'm pretty happy about the fact that it is out. Right now, it's not readily available online. It takes a while to kind of filter into various systems. I've noticed it on some foreign markets, but not anything domestically or whatever. But The Strophes of Job, I'm pleased that it's out in the world finally. So let me stop yammering here, and I don't know. Let me toss over to Grant for a second. You did your reading last week. How did you find that whole experience? I thought it was a great reading.
Oh, I had a great time, and my daughter really enjoyed it, and she said, who was that cool dude sitting on his porch? And I'm like, oh, that's my buddy Adam Bolts. She goes, that guy's the coolest cat. She just thought he was really present and cool, So, but yeah, she
Now, wait a
really
sec.
got.
She didn't say that about any of us? Oh,
Yeah,
what?
that's
Well,
where I thought we were going with that.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
sorry,
Yeah, I thought
man.
for sure. Yeah.
It's a shout
Oh,
out to Adam, but no, she loved it. She said it was a great reading, great discussion. She really liked the Q&A. Thought there were some really good questions asked, and yeah, she and my wife loved it, and she appreciated. And this might be just something for people in the future, although she herself was hiding behind a photograph. She really, she really liked folks that were present in the room and you could see who they were. And she said, like, I just wasn't feeling good about myself, but I really appreciate the folks that were there that you could see. And so just something to mention out there on Front Street. But no, I thought it was great. I thought Jeremy read great. I mean, I loved what you said about his collection. They're like poems on steroids. Like it's a chapbook, but each poem is dense because there's long lines, they're prose poems and or kind of prose poems. And they're not little short lyrics, like with a lot of white space. They really demand kind of what Brady was talking about last time we talked with the fiction that he likes. They really demand that the reader be engaged and try to figure out connections that are going on in the work. So yeah, I thought it was tremendous. I had a great time and good people. My only regret was I wish a few more folks had logged on. And I know it was March break here. But I sent out a communique to a ton of people. It would have been nice to have just a bit of a bigger audience, but what's that? Jonathan Richman, when I was at Illinois, played, I think it was the Empress one night, and there was hardly anybody there. But his attitude was, 10 people, 100 people, 1,000 people, you still put on the best show you can put on. So I had a blast with the people that were there. So it was a lot of fun.
Right, right. Yeah. Well, Brady, you said you were going to be maybe a little depressed after the reading because it was so dark. Were you able to rebound spiritually after the reading, or?
no, no, I've been in, yeah, curled up on the floor ever since. No, it was, I mean, it was dark, but it was a terrific reading. And one of the things that I enjoyed most, and so Grant, you'll forgive me, but I think some of, and I'm conscious of this as someone who goes to readings and someone who occasionally will also read. I think Grant's background and active life in the theater, sort of comes through in the reading. Like I thought you inhabited the character, and I thought you really had a great sense of cadence. And I mean, it's your language, but you also enjoyed the language, and so it was fun. It was fun to see. I mean, of course, I've seen you read before, but I was reminded that you're one of the you have a really nice presence, and you really inhabit that
Thanks.
occasion. So that
Yeah,
was fun. I
thanks,
mean,
man. Yeah, I think a lot of it is the acting training, but a lot of it, there's a lot of me in that character. So it's not quite. It's funny the word you chose, cadence, because coming back to the cool cat sitting on the porch, he sent me a wonderful text, and it's exactly what he said. Oh, it's so great hearing you read, bro. I really love your cadence. So
yeah.
anyway, I thought that was awesome. So
Well, I
yeah.
think it's worth thinking about when you're giving a reading. I mean, of course, there's a certain kind of tension. Perhaps you guys don't feel it, but I do. When you get up in front of a group of folks to read, and you want them to like it, you want them to be engaged, and so you have to put some thought even into the kind of uh, how you're presenting yourself and how you're presenting your work. So it was a master class in how to read well.
Oh, thanks,
And
man.
and JD did terrific as well. I mean, really
Yeah,
clearly,
I
yeah.
told Jeremy one of the things I've been really impressed with the collection, but also with him. Um, and he's not a closed-mouthed guy. That's not what I'm trying to say, but he's made himself more vulnerable, I think, in the recent poetry he's been writing. Because it's very personal, and he makes these connections, and he didn't share this with you guys during the reading, but he did a previous reading on campus, and he talked about, he comes from a bit of a hard scrabble background too, and um he was working at Kroger's, and he had to steal like a burrito, like a 29-cent burrito or a 99-cent burrito, because they they didn't he didn't get a lunch break. He couldn't afford to bring his own lunch. So, and then he couldn't even warm the damn thing up in a microwave. So he had to eat these frozen burritos. Like that just to tell that story puts a grit to the work, and you realize this is coming from a real place. Like he's lived this. So this isn't, anyway, I've been so impressed. He's got another reading coming up here in the community on Thursday, final Thursday, with not today, but next week, and I'm looking forward to hearing him read again. He's got a terrific story, poem called the Piano, which is just amazing. So anyway, I I just been impressed with him being more personal in his work. Not that he wasn't before, but he kind of like did stuff with form and classical stuff, and I just feel the more recent stuff is just really cool, but that's the kind of stuff I like. I like putting yourself on Front Street there, and I just think there's something about vulnerability is a strength, I think, not a weakness. And I think when you connect with people, and if you're vulnerable and they're responding to that, there is some kind of shared experience that's positive and strong. So, and I felt we both were bringing that to the table on at the reading.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just to kind of underscore, that's available, at all of our usual places: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, as bonus episode 1. That's the reading we're talking about here. As you guys talk, I was very much reminded of when I first started taking workshop classes. I've mentioned before that my main kind of teacher, and then eventually kind of my mentor and my thesis director, was the novelist Kent Harif. And Kent would do this thing on the first night of workshop classes. Obviously, it's that night where there's nothing to workshop yet, because we're just meeting for the first time and so forth. But he would kind of tell us at the very beginning to be ready for this, and then he would kind of go over some nuts and bolts stuff about the course. Meanwhile, we were kind of cogitating. He was going to go around the room, and of course, there'd only be a dozen or so of us in these graduate courses, and he'd want us each to share a highly personal story or fact about ourselves that we had never told anyone else. And now, obviously, we weren't hooked up to lie detectors, so there's no way to know. But my sense was that everybody took it legitimately, and I expressed some things I think I had 2 or 3 of those kind of classes with Kent, and so I came up with 2 or 3 things were pretty personal. I'd never told anyone. But his point was that to be an effective writer, you have to be willing to go to those places and to kind of put them out there in public. And so it was just sort of, it was a very practical kind of a lesson of just, again, accepting, embracing that vulnerability kind of in the service of your art or whatever. And to be honest with you, I've always struggled with that. I mean, I've been writing now for 40 years, and in spite of Kent's lessons and his encouragement, it is difficult to put stuff out there that is really personal and clearly, related to you as the author or whatever. So I see you kind of nodding, Grant. You still struggle a bit with that, even though you obviously do it to some extent.
Yeah, I don't struggle with it as much as when I first started writing. I wrote about people that were nothing like me. So I wrote like fantasy pieces about being blue collar, because that's my background. But I wasn't an auto mechanic. I never rode a motorcycle in my life, And so I would have these stories about guys hanging out in pool halls and fixing cars and driving motorcycles. And it just was inauthentic, in the sense I was so afraid to explore who I was. I remember my first workshop, Steve Heller gave me the award for the writer who writes the least amount about himself. And it was kind of a backhanded compliment, like, kid, you should, explore who you are and your identity a little bit more than escaping, And it took me some time, but once I got into my 30s, I'd say 40s, I was more comfortable with. And I think a lot of it had to do with acting. I mean, because it's funny, you told that story. there was an acting exercise we had to do where we would sit with our scene partner with our knees together and hold hands, and we would say three things about what we liked about the other person, and then no, two things about what we liked about the other person. And then the third thing is we would share something about ourselves that we exactly what you were talking about, Ted, that you've never shared with anybody before. And take a risk with what you share. It's not supposed to be like, hey, I find you hot. That's not what you're doing here. But you say, I admire this about you, and I admire this, blah, blah, blah. And then you say something about yourself. And then the scene work right afterwards, you go back and then Richard would say, okay, let's do the scene again. And suddenly there's chemistry, it's different. There's trust, there's intimacy. It was amazing. And so I think I started putting a lot of those principles into play in my writing, and just not worrying about. The only thing I worry about sometimes is revealing things about other people. And my feeling is if they had power over me, like a parent, I'm okay revealing some dark truths. But if it's a sibling who we're more on equal footing with, there's some things I haven't ever shared about my sister or brother. I just feel it's just not right. That's just the feeling I have. But about my dad and my mom, I let it all hang out, So
Right.
anyway.
Yeah. Brady, have you, what are your thoughts on putting yourself out there and drawing on personal ideas and that kind of thing?
Well, this conversation is putting stress on, and so I'll deflect from me, but Grant, one of the things I appreciated during the Q&A following your reading, and then putting together with Jeremy's comments, that in the opening of Neon Kiss, the father figure is absent twice, a twice absent father, and it connected with some of what you had said about your experiences as a child and your upbringing and that kind of vulnerability. Yeah, I find that really challenging. Certainly I want to put up high walls. Like I might peek over, like, wave at the reader a little bit. But there was one story in the collection, The Term Between. I mean, there's a couple of Kill Floor stories, and I worked a lot of summers and holidays, many years worth on the Kill Floor meatpacking plant. But the one where it's a very short story, but I imagine myself in the place of the animals, and run myself through. So I suppose there was getting at some of the core of my experience. But I guess I share with Ted a certain degree of reluctance. Like I like to imagine the lives of characters, but not bring myself in any obvious way to the table, to the letters.
Well, I've just started this past week teaching that class that I teach occasionally, which is a kind of introductory or orientation class for new MFA students. And so we've been talking about this, specifically the last few days via the discussion board, et cetera, about vulnerability. And one of the things that kind of coming back to Grant's comment there is that, I've definitely shied away from talking about family and friends and really and kind of revealing maybe some personal things about them, because I don't want to, I don't think it's fair. I don't want to alienate those folks, but yet a lot of writers have gone there. And I think particularly of like someone like Saul Bellow, who I love is writing. He's a Chicago guy, and so I've read a bunch of Saul Bellow, and he was a favorite of my teachers when I was working on my graduate stuff. And so he was always coming up in our reading list, but he had a horrific personal life because he wrote about, everyone in his life, his spouses and his family, and it just revealed, and it was, fiction, but thinly veiled. And so he sacrificed his relationships with his, again, spouses and children and whoever else, in the service of what is some great fiction. And so I guess, you got to make that decision. I've always held back and not gone there, but there are writers out there who have done that, and they've benefited artistically, financially, whatever you want to say. But the end result is having some pretty awful, personal lives. And my wife and I just started watching the Hulu series Feud, Capote and Capote and the Swans or whatever it's called. And it's about Truman Capote and how when he was suffering from writer's block for years, he ended up writing this really scathing kind of fiction, but thinly veiled about these women that he had become friends with in New York, and revealed just terrible, terrible things about them and their marriages and so forth. And it was a huge hit, fiction wise, but it completely destroyed his relationship with what had been his closest circle of friends or whatever. So it's a tough call sometimes, I think.
Shout out to Saul Bellow, The Adventures of Augie March. It's one of my all-time favorite novels. I am Chicago. How does it say, Ted? I am Chicago born and bred. Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, based it very closely on his circle of friends. And I mean, he was such, seemingly unpleasant guy. Like, I don't think he suffered too much fallout other than, no one liked him, but maybe no one liked him anyway. Yeah.
Well, you probably know, Grant, that I think On the Road was delayed publication a couple of years because the publisher's legal department either had Kerouac himself or they themselves went around and got people to sign these waivers because the characters in there were so closely aligned with real people that the publisher didn't want to get sued for defamation or whatever. And so it took them a couple of years to get all the signatures that they needed to put that book forward. At least that's my understanding.
And then years later, when they brought out the scroll or whatever it was, they put the real names back in, so that's kind of cool to read. I love On the Road. I am, this is a tricky conversation because for me, I love Hemingway's art. Everything I hear about him, he's a jerk. But there are stories of his that I have ripped on. I can't tell you how many times I've taken the concept of the killers and used it in a crime story I've written, with two hitmen and just playing with it, doing different things with it.
Well, in fact, just recently, the story you shared with us, Grant.
Yeah. Absolutely. So I don't know. So the art, I like the idea of the legacy of the art, but I also get where you guys are coming from in terms of the destruction, the collateral damage you leave in its wake. So it's a tricky thing.
So Brady, help me with the title because for some reason I had a mental block. But we actually published at 12 Winters Journal a story that you wrote that clearly was a kind of homage to a classic Hemingway. And I think I typed the title of the story wrong like 5 times somehow, and you kept having to contact and say, no, it's not quite that. But what was that story that you wrote that was clearly Hemingway inspired? And tell us a little bit about that.
Well, yeah, the White Hills of the Ebro, and so it was. A response to Hills Like White Elephants, so Grant, one of my all-time favorite stories, one of my most favorite stories, favoritist stories to teach. It's so brilliantly done. And so I had been reading, so I'm getting fired up here, but I've been reading in this little poetry anthology called Conversation Pieces, which of course we all know about, all the replies, like a poet will write a poem and
right.
Then so that's my cat howling. And then a bunch of poets will write back, to a sonnet. And so the White Hills of the Ebro is a write back, my imagining what happens to the young woman, the girl, that the guy, the narrator calls the girl in Hills Like White Elephants. And so it's a direct conversation piece, with Hemingway. So that story has had such an impact on the way I think about fiction and how fiction works, and in particular how you present details, how you tell a story without by showing and not by telling, right? It's all just as if it were a kind of stage play that we're sort of eavesdropping on this conversation between this young couple. Yeah, so my conversation piece is what happened after. And so in the story, the woman, now grown, has a grown daughter, and they're in that same train station. And she seems to have engineered this moment in order to try to tell her daughter something. We're not exactly sure. But yeah, so it's because I wanted to have some of that same mysteriousness of that, the original story. Will she go along with the guy's will, or the young woman, will she set out on her own? So yeah, Hemingway. Great technique, great story. Yeah. Is that what you
So
asked,
people,
Ted? I'm nattering
yeah,
on.
yeah. Well, I was gonna say no. So people could, thanks to the wonders of technology, I'm sure Hills Like White Elephants is probably online somewhere. Way past copyright, I presume. So someone could, not right now, but as soon as this podcast is over, you get done listening to it. Look up Hills Like White Elephants, which is a brief short story, and then go to 12 Winters Journal and read Brady's, response to it. That would be a great. It'd be a great hour or so out of your day. So yeah, no, that's a great. I'm not sure I fully understood that close of a connection between the two because it'd been so long since I had read Hills Like White Elephants. So that's really cool. So I'm glad I asked you about it.
That's one
Well,
of those
no,
stories.
I tried to structure it the whole way. Like, yeah, it's a direct, absolutely in conversation. So yeah, sorry, Grant, I cut you off.
No, I was just gonna say that's like one of my probably 5 favorite Hemingway stories. That's just a great story. Indian Camp, that one, Clean, Well Lighted Place. Yeah, it's just wow. Yeah, it's a good one. Jake, I think Jake's your name. I was gonna say one other thing too. Is it The Short Happy Life of Francis McComber? There's one of the story where I think suddenly Hemingway has a lion's point of view. Right. And I
Yeah,
was thinking about what you were
completely
saying a few minutes ago, and I was like, reminds me of Hemingway. And so then yeah. Anyway,
I teach uh, The Old Man and the Sea in my novella and long story course, and I teach it mainly for the point that oftentimes young writers, new writers, when they're up and coming and taking creative writing classes, and maybe we've touched on this in earlier podcasts, this idea, but this idea of staying very strictly in one point of view. Once you establish first person or third person omniscient or third person close or whatever, that it's like a cardinal sin to break that POV in the story. Hemingway breaks it all over the place in Old Man and the Sea. I mean, we think, well, it's mainly, the old man, he goes out to catch the marlin, and it's a story from his perspective. But if you really read it carefully, he'll drift into the boy's point of view, the boy that is kind of, taking care of him. And then the shark, I think we get the shark's point of view at one point when they're trying to eat the marlin. And then we get like these tourist point of view. But it's done so seamlessly that I don't think, without looking for it, a lot of readers would even pick up on it. So anyway, I always give my graduate students that novella to read and largely focus on, this is a great example of breaking the rules and having it be highly successful.
yeah. I was talking to my daughter about this, Elizabeth, because she's writing a novel right now with 3 points of view, and she moves around from these different perspectives. And she picked up a technique from Anthony Doerr, which is all the light we cannot see. Big long novel, but the way you can head hop, and that's what they say in creative writing classes now. No head hopping, although writers head hopped all over the place years ago, as we've talked about before. But what Doerr does, he'll have short scenes, almost like a lyric, and then he'll be in sort of a limited third consciousness on one character, and then another short scene, and he can move to another character's conscious, and that way he can head hop, but not get. So when the boy and the girl, Marie Laveau, and I can't remember the German kid's name, Wilmer or something like, gosh, when they get together, we don't have that problem of, oh, we got to go here, we got to go there. He'll just decide, okay, for these few passages, it's her perspective. Then his few passages, these next few passages, his, like after a space break. So that's a clever technique for folks out there that want to have more of an ensemble cast and not follow either the first person format or the limited third format, but want to have a bigger narrative perspective. That might be one way to do it, is to look at Anthony Doerr. And that was actually something Elizabeth alerted me to, because I had 2 of my students writing novels, and they were like, how do I do? I want to have a lot of different perspectives. And well, let me think about that. And then I asked my daughter, and she alerted me to this book. So anyway, it's worth looking at in terms of that technique.
Ray, do you have any thoughts on that shifting POV kind of thing, or?
Oh, well, I mean, when we were discussing where we might go with today's conversation, we talked about maybe we would touch on free indirect discourse, and so since we had that conversation, I've been thinking about this issue of point of view, and of course I like polyphony. I like the diversity of voices, and so you always it's how to handle it. I mean I'm changing points of view in some works of fiction as often as I can, but you have to somehow invent ways to do that doesn't keep shocking the reader. So what Grant describes with Door, that's a great technique.
Well, I mentioned that this new book is a prequel to Crow Song for the Stricken, and when I wrote Crow Song, I very much had that in mind because everything I'd written up to that point, I was very, locked into a particular point of view, and not that I didn't know you could break that rule, but I just, as a writer, I just was kind of invested in that. But I read War and Peace. It took me several months, but I read Tolstoy's War and Peace finally. I was in like my mid 40s or something, and one of the things I noticed about that book was that you would, and talk about a polyphony of characters. You'd start off in a scene and you'd be with Pierre or whoever, and you'd be in kind of his point of view and things would be going on. And then you get to the end of the scene and you realize, oh, son of a gun, we're now in some other character's point of view. And I never noticed when that shift happened. And so I'd like stop and backtrack and figure out when Tolstoy had pulled that kind of sleight of hand almost, because again, it was so seamless and so effortless that I didn't notice it when I was first reading it. And so I thought, okay, I want to do that. I want to write a book with multiple characters. I want to play around with changing point of view in midstream. And so that's why that was one of my main goals when I set out writing Crow Song for the Stricken. And obviously I've kind of continued with that now with this prequel. But it's really fun and interesting to free yourself from just trying to stay within that very limited, scope, whatever you decide you want it to be. Well, yeah, we talked about free indirect discourse a couple of times in our podcast, and you guys had wanted to maybe focus on that. So maybe why don't we do that? Why don't we kind of shift to that in particular, and then that's going to be a segue to a story, which is going to be our featured story out of Sand Journal, which I'll talk more about here in just a minute. I know Grant has some things to say about free indirect discourse in connection to this, but don't do it yet, Grant. Don't jump.
Okay, so
but
we
let's
have
talk
to keep Grant under control.
That's right. Yeah. Well, like I said, I learned my lesson to be much more directive in terms of the thing. But anyway, maybe we could talk for just a minute about that sort of technique that we're focusing on here, and then we can use that to sort of drift into talking about our featured stories. So I don't know, Grant, would you want to? I know you've sung the praises of free indirect discourse in particular a few times. Would you want to kind of define that for our listeners as you are thinking of it, and we can kind of go from there?
Yeah, I think it's always been there. I mean, you read, and I've mentioned this before, you read early Philip Roth, he's more of a scene-driven writer. Then you get to later Philip Roth and you see him evolve into more of this narrative telling and free and direct discourse. And I think, or at least what I heard from others, is around 2008, there was a shift in the Academy, and suddenly speculative fiction became very popular. And literary journals started publishing speculative fiction, but speculative fiction was in some ways a return to storytelling, not story showing. And you tell a story like Once Upon a Time. I'm exaggerating, but that's the kind of thing you do. And so what I love about the fact that spec fic has come back is it's also increased in literary fiction writing free and direct discourse techniques that I stole from Jane Austen, who I studied as an undergrad, and admired her craft. So what I like about it is, well, several things.
Could you kind of, what is it, by the way? Let's,
I think it's
for those who aren't quite sure what we're talking about.
Sure. I think of it as, okay, the effects of it is we can take a scene that might take 4 pages of dialogue if you did it in strict realist terms, with quote marks around the dialogue. But once you go into free and direct discourse, you can enter into a character's head, kind of paraphrase, summarize, do a little bit of what the dialogue is. And the writer, the writer we have for today does this, and I'll talk about that once we get, and I'll point out the technique in a specific paragraph. But it allows you to compress, to summarize, and suddenly things can move. I can take a 4-page scene and make it a 2 paragraphs by using this free and direct discourse model. And what I like about it as a writer is, and it's not just about speed and economy, it's about, we don't need every detail. I don't need to know, hey, come on into my office. Okay, yeah, well, let's talk about the opening paragraph here, bad topic sentence. Look at this here. Supporting details. You could just say in a free and direct discourse mode, Professor Smith told the student that her paragraph needed some work. That's it. We don't need to, I don't need 2 pages of explaining what needed work. And later they discussed blah, blah, blah. But one day while he was talking to her, he noticed the dress she was wearing. And that's one of Tolstoy's moves, where you kind of use the habitual tense, which is a series of ongoing events. Every Tuesday, a group of writers get together at the local coffee shop to discuss politics, sports, and creative writing. But on this one particular Tuesday, Sheila announced to the group she was getting divorced. And suddenly we've tunneled down to a specific moment. So we have this ongoing, Alice Munro uses this technique all the time. Joan Silber, I can think of tons of writers, but they're taking it from the Russians, who I think sort of mastered it. Malamud used it. So it's like we can describe months, weeks of scene work, and then tunnel down to a specific moment in a kind of half scene. And it's, so for me, that's narrative economy. Now, the more simple part of free and direct discourse, if you look at the page you've got in front of you and you're the writer and you see tons of dialogue, maybe get rid of some of that. Maybe summarize it and then go into a bit of free and direct discourse to create more uncertainty, because what we're getting isn't really what was said. It's an approximation. And I love that, because I'm a mystery writer. So I can't remember what we just said 10 minutes ago exactly, what you said, Ted, or Brady said. I know what we talked about. I know the gist of what you said. So it seems to me free and direct discourse would be a great way to say, Ted discussed, blah, blah, blah. Brady said, and then blah, blah, blah. But what Brady said isn't exactly what he said, because I didn't put direct quotes around it. It's sort of an approximation. And so anyway, it's a technique I've really embraced for the last 10 years or so. And part of it was I shared a novel with a professor who was a mentor to me. And I remember he said, Grant, you got a lot of dialogue in here. And I said, oh, and then I started thinking about, well, how can I break up that dialogue? And the way to do it was through this means of summary, compression, and free and direct discourse. That's a lot of info with that, but I'll let you guys run with that. But
that's great. Brady, I know you're a big fan. Your team in indirect discourse as well. What are some of your points that you would make about its use, et cetera?
Well, yeah. So fascinating conversation and fascinating narrative technique, and the way that Grant explains it, absolutely wonderful from the writer's point of view. And I often think of free and direct discourse when I have my from the scholarly point of view. But I want to preface this by saying that I'm distrustful. I am still distrustful, even though I like polyphony. I am distrustful of a third-person omniscient point of view, because I always want to know, how does the narrator know that? How could anyone possibly know that about someone else's consciousness? How could they, how can Henry James inhabit, how can Henry James's narrators or Dickens's narrators inhabit and know so clearly what's going on in somebody else's head? I'm distrustful of it. And so I tend to rely, or tend to prefer in some ways first person, but a vast array of first persons speaking for themselves, because I don't trust third person. But the third person free and direct discourse, where the author, the narrator is representing the thoughts of the character, but they're also blending it with their own consciousness. Like there's this kind of richness of narrative point of view that you get in free, indirect discourse. And Henry Louis Gates, nattering on, and I'll stop, but Henry Louis Gates Jr. has this wonderful essay on free and direct discourse on Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Are Watching God. And so how we get what Janie is experiencing and how she's viewing things and how we're understanding things. And the narrator's language is different than Janie's language, right? It's a kind of blending of, we were talking before about cadences, and the way that Janie and her community speak is different in some ways than the narrative voice speaks, but you get at this idea of consciousness and perspective through free and direct discourse that is so rich and so telling. And that narrator I trust. I don't know why. How do they know that about somebody else? But there it is. It's the problem of point of view. So free and direct discourse. Not only do you get to get rid of quotation marks and do the kinds of things that Grant's talking, but it's already just said this, but it's that kind of melding of consciousness that I find fascinating. So I don't know if that's helpful for any of our auditors or listeners, but that's some of the stuff that's been on my mind.
Brilliant. That puts it square on the head, man. That was fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, I have more to say about that, but parenthetically, I'll add, I actually know Henry Louis Gates Jr. on a somewhat personal level. And he is as smart and as friendly and as funny and as great of a person, just one-to-one, as he always appears to be in television, et cetera, et cetera. Hey, just want to throw that out because, sometimes people's public persona is one thing and their private is another, but he is genuine across the board. I love Henry Louis Gates Jr. Skippy, as his friends call him, by the way. Truly, that's his nickname. But, when I wrote Men of Winter, which was my first novel, I used free indirect discourse for a very specific narrative purpose, which I don't know that the 5 people who read that novel took note of. But it's a first person perspective, and it's consistently first person point of view, et cetera. But there's a lot of dialogue in it. The narrator is having a lot of dialogue. He ends up staying in this boarding house for much of the novel, and there's all these other people he's interacting with. So we get all this dialogue. Towards the end of the novel, what I was trying to create was this idea that he was moving from the realm of reality into some sort of nether realm. And he encounters this little girl, he and his partner at the time, that this woman he's kind of, partnered up with. They encounter this little girl who's living by herself. And I wanted to try to get across the idea that she's kind of part of their world, but she really is more connected to the sort of netherworld. So I tried something, and again, no one seems to have noticed, but there's all these conversations with her, but I don't ever give her direct dialogue. I don't ever put anything she says in quotation marks. So someone will ask her a question, for example, and I'll put that in quotation marks, but then her response is always given to us, as paraphrase. Nowhere in that, she's like in the last 2 or 3 chapters of the book and becomes a pretty important character, but I never give her any direct dialogue. And again, no one seems to have paid any attention, but I tried to use it as a specific technique to get across this idea that she wasn't quite fully on the page. So I guess my point here, if I have one, is that it can be used for various sorts of effects that you might be going for, besides sort of condensing, dialogue and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, let me, we've been going on for a while, as we tend to do, but let's go ahead and drift into our featured story. Listeners and viewers of our podcast know that every episode we have a featured story, and I really am pleased to talk about this one today. It's from Sand magazine, and Sand is a really cool journal. I've been a subscriber for years. Sandjournal.com is where you can go to find out about them. And they actually, it's an English language journal, but it's published out of Berlin, Germany. And so most of the writers and artists and so forth they publish are not from the US. So it really gives a neat kind of cultural, multicultural perspective or whatever. But anyway, we're going to talk about a story which I knew Brady out there in Missoula would really get into. It's called Bear Hunting, and it's by an author, and I'm not sure I'm going to say the first name correctly, although I did look it up and try to figure it out, but I think it's Brecken Blakesley, is the author, and they have a website, breckenblakesley.com, so you can go check them out. And I'll give you a little more information about Brecken here in just a few minutes. But bear hunting is this really cool, very brief story. I just was kind of curious. So I tried to sort of figure out, and so I came up with about 1,500 words. So, again, that may not be completely accurate, but just kind of eyeballing it and counting some lines here and there. I think it's around 1,500 words. So very brief, but yet a lot of really interesting stuff is happening. So let me give just kind of a brief overview, and then maybe I'll see what Brady's perspective is. Then Grant, like I said, he's already loaded for bear. Thank you, to talk about free indirect discourse as it appears in this story. But let me just kind of read from the very beginning, because it's one of the great opening lines, opening paragraphs in the history of literature. Going back to Chaucer. I don't know. No, it's a great opening, and here it is. This is Bear Hunting from Sand magazine, and Brecken Blakesley is the author. And it begins. It had been 3 weeks since her girlfriend was eaten by a bear, and she still couldn't talk about it without laughing. Her girlfriend hadn't been eaten so much as chewed, with bites taken out of some vital areas, so saying eaten ensured people knew that her girlfriend was dead, whereas saying mauled could lead to confusion. She and her girlfriend had argued right before her girlfriend left, and the last things they said to each other were, quote, "I'm angry at you, but I still love you," and, quote, "I'm angry at you too, but I still want you to have a fun time." And again, we try not to give too much away about the stories that we feature, but it's hard not to give too much away in a 1,500-word story. But essentially, the main character decides she wants revenge on this bear that killed her girlfriend, and so she wants to hunt the bear, thus the title. But she has no experience whatsoever in hunting anything, let alone hunting a bear. And so that kind of is the driving force behind the rest of the narrative there. But I don't know, like I said, Brady, let me kick it over to you. Do you have any kind of general thoughts about the story? And like I said, Grant will maybe take up the issue of free indirect discourse as the author masterfully uses it in this story.
Yeah, no, it's a terrific story. It's got this weird tone that is set right from that. I mean, I had to read the first sentence a few times. Like, she couldn't talk about it without laughing. Her girlfriend was eaten by a bear. Yeah, so and the weirdness of the story, the strangeness of the perspective and the inhabiting of the narrator of the character's consciousness, and I'll kick it over to Grant in a second. It's handled expertly throughout, and it's kind of an amazing and not to give anything away, but what transpires in the story is kind of amazing. But I do want to say, I want to go on the record that yeah, this is touching on a pretty deep fear of mine, because there are, of course, black bears, and I've encountered black bears lots and lots of times on my hikes, many, many times. It's not uncommon. We have bears on my campus. We have this alert system, the timely warning alert system from the campus police force. And so we get these all the time. Don't go over here if you see a bear. And so they're always reminding us, what do you do when you encounter a bear? But black bears are one thing. In the Bitterroot Mountains, and I'm looking at the end of the range as it runs in to Missoula, just out my window. I'm literally looking somewhat down the Bitterroot. They have reintroduced grizzly bears. They've allowed grizzly bears to move back in. And this changes everything. If you're a hiker, yeah, right? As the story points out, again, not to give anything away, bear spray is not really that effective. Grizzlies aren't really deterred by bear spray or handguns, and so you would need something like the Ruger that the character. So this was a pretty frightening. What I'm saying, this roundabout way, is this is a pretty frightening, visceral story, and the weird tone of it just made its impact all that much more. Yeah, expertly staged, expertly handled, strange as can be. Now, in terms of technique, I'll stop talking and I'll pass it over to Grant.
Well, I love that, Brady. Making yourself vulnerable. That's good, man.
I am afraid. Yes, is that vulnerability? Is fear? Yeah.
Well, I was telling Ted before we came on the air. I I read the story before I went to bed last night. Maybe not a good idea, but I had a recurring dream. Like it kept happening. Like I'd wake up and then go back to sleep. But there was this bear, and I was at my grandma's house in Toronto, and I must have shot the damn thing 6 times and it would not die. It kept rising from the dead and was like threatening us. And my dad was in the dream and he gave me a rifle, but it was more like a zip gun with a rubber band and bullets. And anyway, not
So yes. So thank you, Ted. We're both saying.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
But I agree. I love the voice of this piece. It's got like this comical edge to it, but there's also the voice of trauma. It's very engaging. But I just want to look at one paragraph. Just the technique here is exquisite, and it's a technique I try to teach my students because they take so many workshop classes where they're always told show don't tell, show don't tell, and I really think that is because it's easier to be good at showing than it is to be good at telling. If you don't do telling well, it can be boring. If you don't do showing well, it could just be a little bit thin. But if you do it well, say, "Oh, look at those details. Oh, look at the world." But do I really need to know that the car has fuzzy dice hanging from the rearview mirror? I mean, is that really a necessary detail? That's the kind of thing you would get good marks for with showing if you did a scene with an automobile. But this is the first page, and just gonna piggyback on what I was saying earlier. The funeral would have been closed casket if the family hadn't chosen cremation. She asked her girlfriend's mother if she could have some of the ashes. That's not direct, that's just summary, right? She asked her girlfriend's mother if she could have some of the ashes, and her girlfriend's mother said, not to be ridiculous, she wasn't divvying up her daughter's remains among all her friends. And that's one of those moments that Brady's talking about, where we're getting summary, but I'm also hearing the consciousness and the voice of the girlfriend's mother in that, right? I mean, that's just brilliant. Later, her girlfriend's brother stopped by with a small box of ashes and told her not to tell his mom. She told him to choose something of his sisters to remember her by. Again, I can hear the blending there. Yeah, why don't you choose something to remember me by? So it's like mixing of those voices. But again, it creates uncertainty because it's not exactly what was said. It's an approximation, and it's that melding of consciousnesses that Brady was saying. But when he asked which things were hers and which were his sisters, she looked around and realized she couldn't remember. Then we get direct dialogue. That carving, she said, the one on the mantle, that was hers. So the writer chooses the moment to give this, that she thinks has the most gravitas or weight to give, they think has the most gravitas or weight to share with us. That carving, she said, the one on the mantle, that was hers. And then she laughed because it was a wooden bear her girlfriend had bought as a joke in a tourist shop in the Adirondacks. She tried to explain why it was so funny. Brilliant. She tried to explain why it was. We don't need a 2-page scene showing us how she tried to explain. Who cares? It's not that important. Just the fact that she tried. That's compression. That's a great choice. She tried to explain why it was so funny, but she couldn't stop laughing. Her girlfriend's brother said he'd come back later when the shock had worn off. And that last part I read is not in quotes. Her girlfriend's brother said, an approximation. The choice to keep that in third person, like you could have said, her girlfriend's brother said, I'll come back later when the shock had worn off, and not put quote marks around it, because that would still suggest a kind of approximation, free and direct discourse. But to keep it even further removed is more of the melding of the consciousness of the writer, narrator, whatever, implied author, and the character. So that's just one paragraph that just packs so much technique in it, and this is technique that's on display throughout. So I love it.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why, and I kind of went on about the brevity of the story in terms of word count. But the reason I was kind of looking at that in the first place is because, in spite of that brevity, there is so much going on in this story that I think one could get the impression it was a much longer piece. And let me kick it over to Brady again, see if you want to respond to anything Grant had said or whatever you'd like to say.
No, well, I think Grant's reading of that paragraph is outstanding. The technique is amazing, and I kept thinking in the first read, and then even through the second read, I think kept thinking to myself, there's no way they can bring this story to an end. Like there's like, as when you look at it, it's 5 pages long, and there's no way they can do it, and yet it's this compression, it's this mastery of technique. Fueled by the weird tone and the trauma, as Grant noted, of the situation, something that Ted is expert on. Yeah, it's expertly staged, and then that the real compression, I think, is in just the last, like the as close as we'll come to a resolution of the dramatic tension, the trauma in the story. It's so compressed, and yet it works so brilliantly. But it all depends. I mean, a large part of it depends upon the technique that Grant just described.
Who knows why exactly I choose the stories I choose to send you guys. This particular journal, I really was there was like 3 or 4 fiction pieces that are all just like outstanding, and I really mulled or mulled over which to choose you guys, or which to send to you guys. And one of the things I think was probably working away on my semi-consciousness was the fact, as I've mentioned before, because of Brady talking so much about Faulkner in a previous episode, I went back and reread The Bear, Faulkner's little novella, part of Go Down Moses. And and it's a very similar, basic plot. It's about a bear hunt. But in that, Faulkner just goes into elaborate detail about tracking the bear, and they have these close encounters with the bear. And, and again, it's a wonderful story. I think I posted on social media that after rereading it again, I really feel like it's one of the greatest novellas in the English language. So I'm not dissing Faulkner, but it is so different in technique from this story, which is also about a bear hunt, while Faulkner is expanding on, the minutest details in many cases, and it's wonderful. This author, they're compressing, very similar kinds of things, and it is equally, impactful and artful and all those kinds of things. So sometimes expansion is the way to go, and sometimes compression is the way to go. And I guess that's when it becomes an art and not a science. Is how do you feel your way through that? Yeah, I see you kind of nodding there, Brady. Do you have any thoughts on the bear of Faulkner versus Hunting the Bear here?
Well, Faulkner's language and his approach is so Baroque, really quite the antithesis to this. And I guess I was just, as you were speaking, I was calling back how great Go Down Moses is. What a stunning, powerful, knock you down kind of collection novel. So this is a whole other thing. Like when the character gets the gun, like that would be pages in Faulkner, right? It would be the kind of psychology of shooting, and
we get the history of the history of the gun and the owners of the gun through 3 generations or something.
Yes, right. The Compsons, or so however it came through, whichever family lineage it came down through. So I was nodding just in appreciation not only of your insights into the story and into Faulkner, but just the kind of admiration have for Faulkner's technique across Go Down Moses. And I wonder if The Bear isn't really one of the truly great novellas of all time.
Grant and I had a little bit of time, actually ended up having a lot of time to talk before our first try at this recording today. Brady got sidetracked in some administrative stuff, talk about traumatizing. But one of the things Grant and I talked about when we were just kind of talking casually is there's a little section in this story where the author gives us a list of like just these little blurbs about different bear attacks, people who have been killed by bears. And like it starts off, Laird Child 1, age 1, October 5, 1908, killed at Elysian Grove Pleasure Park while riding in a go-kart. Joseph, quote unquote, Frenchy Duray, 60, June 12, 1922, attacked and partially eaten before crawling 1.5 miles back to his ranch and dying. And it goes on. We get another, 6 or 7 or 8 examples. And Grant and I both suspected that when we were reading this the first time, and probably you did too, Brady, these are probably real episodes. And I did have a chance this morning, and I didn't look up all of them, but I looked up 2 or 3 or 4 of them. And I think I probably found at least one of the sites that Brecken actually probably used for their research to do this. But the reason I want to point it out was because in another podcast, maybe it was our last one, we talked about when you're doing historical fiction, that one of the techniques you can use is to throw in real, historical fact, and then that gives a patina of authenticity to the stuff you're just wholly making up. And this is not historical fiction, but I think Brecken is doing a similar kind of thing here, where they're giving us some actual bare facts, so to speak, and it really gives a patina of authenticity and realness to this story that and it's very brief. It's only half a page, so it isn't a lot, again, not a lot of verbiage there, but it really brings a whole nother dimension to this story, again, in a very compressed kind of way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just wanted to say, just to piggyback on something that was said previously, that you could tell this story the Faulknerian way and make it work. And you could tell this story. Well, let me say, you could show this story the Faulknerian way and make it work. And you could tell this story Brecken's way and it works. And I just want to say to listeners out there, there isn't just one way to write a particular story. So let's say you had a 4,500 word story on bears mauling people, but maybe the market you're trying to get in 2,000 words or less. And you can find a way to make that work. When I was in workshop, the belief was your story messed up because you screwed this up. And if you fix that, your story's going to work. And my feeling is, coming back to Brady's point at the beginning of this podcast, a polyphony. I think there's a polyphony of possibilities, a pluralism of possibilities for stories. All 3 of us could take a story and we could all make it work, and it would be a different story. There's different choices at different points in the road in a story that we can make as a writer. Do we compress here? Do we expand here? And we can make it work. It's just a different story. There's not just one perfect story. But in 1984, 85, there was this mentality that it messed up because you made this one mistake. And
right,
all of us in this room could probably say, did I mess up my life because I didn't do this at this point in my life? No, but different choices emerged and we made other choices. And I married who I married. And if I would have gone to British Columbia, I would have met somebody out. Like, life's full of, these possibilities. And I think that's all I'm trying to say is both of these writers, Faulkner and Brecken, different approaches, different ways to make things work.
Well, not to make everything about myself, but one of the other things I did with Crow's Song for the Stricken that I did again with the Strophes of Job is I'd spent about 10 years writing 3 novels, and I didn't really send any of those excerpts out because literary journals always say, well, you can send an excerpt from a novel if it's a standalone piece. And I'd look at it, I don't know. I don't know if it's a standalone piece. And so I was kind of tired of the kind of isolation of writing these novels and going years without any publishing credits to speak of because I wasn't saying anything out. So when I started writing Crow's Song for the Stricken, I thought, I'm going to try this thing where each chapter, episode, whatever you want to call it, is going to be a standalone short story. But then they're all going to work together to tell this larger framework or whatever. And I'm going to send those things out as I write them. And they all got picked up. And some of them were published multiple times. Some of them won, some lesser awards or whatever. But it felt great for me as a writer to be getting that sort of, validation as I was working on this bigger project or whatever. But here's the thing. When I then would bring them together, well, let me back up a sec. So I had the larger framework in mind. So in those individual stories, there oftentimes are references to things that work in the context of the larger framework, but they don't really even have any relevance to the short story when just looking at it by itself. And I thought, well, should I revise it? Blah, 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 blah. Nah, I'm too lazy for that. I'm not going to worry about it. So I sent out these stories that had these obvious references in them that applied to nothing within the context of the story as far as I was concerned, But yet, editor after editor after editor seemed to be okay with it. And so it really changed my thinking about that whole idea of a standalone piece, because that's very much in the eyes of whatever editor may or may not be interested in publishing it. So that was really an eye-opening experience for me.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story because I know we probably mentioned this before, but I can remember having professors saying, and I've shared this with my students, I've said the exact same thing. Well, the chapter you want to excerpt from, you're probably going to have to make some changes to, to make it stand alone. And that's okay. And then when you go back to the novel, you make the other, it's just a different entity. So, but I love your story with these loose strings here and there that it's okay. The life's full of loose strings. Not everything has to fit together like a geometric shape, So yeah, I think that's a fascinating what do we call it, like lesson for writers to be aware of.
Yeah. I'm curious, Brady, this novel of yours we're working on, A Journey to Al Ramel, I can't remember. Did any of it get published, or has it been published in excerpted form, or is its whole debut going to be its first publication, any of the pieces? I can't quite remember.
No, well, thank you. Yeah, earlier, when I was drafting a very early version of it, some excerpts were published in an online journal, and I was very grateful for that, because, and Ted, and you're talking about your experience. I mean, we spent a lot of time just at our keyboards or writing longhand, however we do it, and we don't really know if anybody's going to be interested, or we don't really. It's an isolated process, and so sometimes to send something out into the world just to see if anybody responds. And so in that case, that was a positive experience for me that encouraged me to keep going with the
Right.
novel. And I have since looked back at those excerpts, and they're not very standalone-ish, but they're a little standalone-ish. So as Grant says, there's all kinds of things out in the world. And I'll just throw this in, because I've been thinking about this and thinking about in terms of our podcasts, and really looking forward to Grant's next novel. Like, Ted, come on, because I want to read the novel I want to read is I've been waiting all my life to read, is a novel a mystery set around the Summit series. And so what I've been thinking about is how prolific you guys are, and I've been thinking about that. I've been trying to get myself out of bed each morning to stay that course. And I know we've talked about it, like, you write for a while, then maybe have to let the well fill up again, and there's different ways. But yeah, that kind of stay with itness, and then also including long stretches of radio silence from a writer as they're doing their thing, trying to get through some work.
Right. As you guys know, I have this kind of unhealthy fascination with the poem Beowulf, and for 40 years now. And so I've been chipping away at a translation of it, of my own, because there's only like 350 modern language translations, and why not 351? But and I love the process, but yet it's not quite the same as writing original fiction. And so there was a time where I was determined, okay, I'm just going to spend however many months or years it's going to take, and I'm going to knock out this translation. But after a while, I was like, okay, I'm not loving this process, because I'm really aching to write some original fiction of my own. So my compromise has been, for the last 6 months or so, Monday through Thursday morning, I work on this novel I'm working on. And then Friday is Beowulf translation day. And so I spend a day working on that. And again, it's a slow process. I may not live long enough to actually translate the whole poem, but it kind of scratches both itches, because if I'm not working on the translation, there's a part of me that wants to be doing that. So it's really difficult when you have so many different interests, and obviously we mentioned that Brady wasn't able to get to the proof pages I sent him around Christmas time, because he had this academic article, this chapter he was working on. And so much of the beginning of 2024 was devoted to that. And so it's just really difficult to find all the time we want to do all the different projects that we want. So yeah. Let me slip in a little bit about Breckin Blakesley here. This is the contributor's note from Sand, and it says Breckin Blakesley grew up in the woods of Pennsylvania tending to an animal graveyard, and now lives in Seattle tending to broken dolls and old bones. Their debut novel, Probably It Will Not Be Okay, is available from Publication Studio. Brecken holds an MFA from the University of Washington. Bothell, I think maybe, I don't know, in creative writing and poetics. Find more of their writing and art at www.breckenblakesley.com. And I know Grant went there. I went there too. And Brecken has several publication credits, including one for Fiction International, a journal that has rejected me many times. So I was very impressed that they have a story published in that particular journal too. So
That's big time. Wow. Yeah. Well, Brady, I just want to say, man, don't worry what other people do, man. You do you, babe. I mean, it works. I mean, what you like, yeah, just be you. I mean, Springsteen, I saw him interviewed years ago, and he says, I work on an album and then I'll go a year or 6 months without writing any songs. That's okay. The boss is great, So anyway, that's what I would say is, yeah, I could turn out these crap, but I have been writing these kinds of things since I was 17. Like I found some real early ones I wrote. God, they were awful, but it's just been a passion of mine for a long, long time, and so I think I live and breathe this stuff all the time. But that's what you do is what you do, and you're awesome. So, yeah, I wouldn't compare yourself or worry about it. You keep churning out great stuff. I'll wait to have something of yours rather than say, come on, man. I'll wait for it to percolate because it's great. So that's all I got to say.
Things are all there's timing is everything, I guess. I think maybe, Grant, I've told you this before, but maybe I haven't. When we first met and I was trying to poach you from your previous publisher, you hadn't published any detective fiction yet. In fact, the first book of yours that we published was a collection of literary stories. But when I started my press, 12 Winters, in 2012, I very deliberately was modeling it after the Hogarth Press, Leonard and Virginia Woolf's press that they used to bring out her own books, but also lots of other books by people like T.S. Eliot and so forth. But just before you and I met in 2015, I was just poking around online or something, and I found this article. And it talked about how Virginia and Leonard Woolf had a real passion for detective stories. And Hogarth Press actually published several detective novels. And I never knew that about Hogarth Press, that I always associated them with this very avant-garde kind of stuff. And so I thought, oh, well, if Hogarth Press can publish that kind of stuff, I think I should be publishing that kind of stuff. And then voila, I meet Grant Tracy, who has all these detective novels he wants to publish, or at that time you had one you wanted to publish. So the timing was really, really cool. You kind of nodded. Were you aware of the Woolf's interest in detective fiction?
Yeah, just a little bit. I mean, my wife's real into there's a podcast she listens to all the time, and it's about the golden age of British crime stories. It's a woman, Caroline Crampton. She Done It, I think, is the series. A little shout out there, Caroline. Return to flavor, please. Thank you. Yeah, and it's a great series. We listened to it when we were driving to Cincinnati, and she's talked a lot about snow and what that sets when you have a snow setting. It's great. And as a writer of more in the American tradition, there's some things from the British tradition I could maybe borrow or even steal, dare I say. So yeah, it's a good series. But yeah, I did know a little bit about that story, but I don't know what the novels were that they published.
Well, like I said, there's an article I found online. It may not be available anymore, but it actually listed like some of the authors and novels and so forth. So, Brady, what would you point to as a wellspring for a journey to Al Ramel? What was there one particular work or author or a couple of authors that sort of inspired this historically based novel that you've written?
Yeah, well, I was reading a bunch of travel journals and travel memoirs, and there's was then back in the day a young English writer, William Dalrymple, And he talked about retracing Marco Polo's journey, like he recreated Marco Polo's journey, and through fairly dangerous areas where he wasn't welcome. And I just loved those stories, and so I had been nonfiction works, and so that sort of whole world was the inspiration for A Journey to Al Ramel, because I kind of got to wondering about those folks, like what makes them undertake these epic, sometimes really dangerous journeys to these really for them obscure corners of the world.
Right.
Hey,
Hey, I'll just. Oh, go ahead, Grant.
I just wanted to ask you guys, because I had this experience recently. Has there been anything, Brady and Ted, that you've come across and you're like, oh my God, that's had an influence on me and I forgot all about it? Like, so for example, Ted, you very kindly mentioned the preface or whatever, the essay at the beginning of Neon Kiss. And I recently watched the entire Monsieur Spade series on AMC. It's fantastic. And then I reread Maltese Falcon. I read Harvest. It's like one of my all-time favorite crime books, but I reread Maltese Falcon, and I realized I've been doing a little bit of a disservice to Mr. Hammett, because the lack of certainty in that novel has definitely inspired my writing. I write differently than Hammett. Hammett has this sort of camera objective point of view, but now and then he'll give us insight, but it's not Spade's insight. It's almost like an implied author's insight, so we can try to figure out things. It's very brilliant the way he writes that. But the trick of Hammett, is that not only is the uncertainty inhabited in the world, we're also uncertain about our hero. Just what does he stand for? What choices is he making? Do we believe everything he tells us? And then
or doesn't tell us.
No, it doesn't tell us exactly. And when I reread Maltese Falcon, I realized at some point I'm going to have to give a shout out. So I'm giving that shout out now because Hammett was one of the first writers I read before Chandler, but I got so immersed in Chandler, I've forgotten the impact Hammett has had on my own work. And so I want to apologize to the Hammett estate for that oversight, but that's just something that occurred to me in just the last 4 or 5 weeks. So I'm wondering if you guys have had an experience like that, where, like, I know, Ted, you've talked a lot about William Gass, but is there something as you were working on it, you're like, gosh, I've reread this book now and I realize this really has meant something to me that I've neglected to acknowledge, I guess is what I mean.
Well, I don't know. I guess my answer to that is I don't think so, but it's only because I very deliberately, when I read something I really like and respect, I will take some technique out of it and I will deliberately use it. And like I mentioned, like, reading War and Peace, and that really led to, my experiments with Crow Song for the Stricken, and I could go through a whole list of things. And so I guess the thing that I'm answering the negative is because I think I'm pretty fully aware of a lot of the inspirations, and I could go back and I could point to pretty much everything I've written and say, okay, on that one I was inspired by this. And like, for example, my little novella, Figures in Blue, I know that I had read a bunch of Marquez, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and I took some techniques that he was using in his novellas, and I definitely had that in mind as I was writing. Now, someone looking at that and looking at Marquez, I'm sure they would not see any sort of similarities. But in my mind, I was very definitely inspired by a particular technique that he was using in that. So I definitely do that, but I think I'm fully aware of my borrowing or stealing or whatever. Brady, what's your response to that?
Oh, well, just listening to the conversation and listening to Grant and you both, Ted. I've been thinking about this actually coincidentally quite a bit lately, that as a young reader, I loved adventure stories. Like I used to read Alistair MacLean, and I'm not even quite sure how does one pronounce his name? John Buchan. He was Lord Tweedsmuir, Governor General of Canada. Jules Verne. And so I love adventure stories. And though then I've immersed myself, professionally, and I think of myself as a writer kind of literary fiction. But I have been thinking, Amy Farmer in her review of The Term Between, these are not your father's adventure stories, but those stories and those ways of talking and those great, going out there into the world, yeah, those inform almost everything I write. And I read those when I was young,
Yeah,
I mean, really young.
I think that was the point I was making. I read Hammett. I wasn't that young, but I was 15, 16. That's when I first started reading
That's what I'm
detective.
talking about. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and so
10, 12,
I
15.
don't
Yeah.
think I was conscious, Ted, at that age of, oh, here's what technique. I think I was just, I got to read as much as I can, and the information will be in the back of my brain, like, and it'll help me as a writer. But I had no idea how to study craft. And I think just now, and I love the Continental Op stories, and I think going back over Maltese Falcon, it was just like, holy crap, I deserve to say something about Hammett's writing, and it's made me want to do more with Hammett, or at least to acknowledge the impact he's had on my work.
I think we're all of a similar age, which means we all kind of went through a very similar, formal education experience. And I remember as a MA, graduate student, kind of MFA, just didn't have the F to go along with it. That, yeah, we were very much raised on literary fiction. I mean, we read John Cheever and John Updike, and on and on and on. And I remember we read, we would read like these craft books, and one of them was John Gardner's, and John Gardner has this line, and I forget which of his it's in, but he says, he defines literary fiction as fiction that's too serious to enjoy. And I kind of had that feeling, because he was writing Grendel, and he was writing, all these novels. Some of them were pretty literary serious, but on the other hand, some of them were historical and blah, blah, blah. And so in my workshop classes, I tended to write that very realistic stuff. But as soon as I got the opportunity, I was writing not about myself, not of my time period. I was really interested in getting outside my own lived experience, at least directly, and writing what I thought was maybe more fun kind of stuff. And I think we've all kind of reached a point now where we're all kind of doing that.
Yeah, I mean,
so go ahead, Grant.
Real quick, I was just going to say, coming back to when you guys were talking about my reading, I think that's what I do with my detective fiction. Is I'm writing in a genre. It has certain rules that I embrace, that I'm trying to reinvent, that I'm trying to, not necessarily deconstruct, but revise, revisionist kind of thing. But at the same time, from my literary writing background, I'm also trying to bring some of myself into that to make it personal, and to give the detective flaws. Well, most detectives have flaws, but you know what I'm saying, like being a victim of abuse kind of thing. That is something I wanted to work in. It's not new. Other writers have done it. Michael Harvey that did it. Brian Gruely's done it. I mean, there's writers I admire that have touched on those themes. I think even Mickey Spillane, unbeknownst to himself, his character has PTSD. It's pretty clear to me that Mike Hammer is suffering from his experiences in the Pacific. So I wanted to combine that sort of vulnerability that I see as being kind of part of literary fiction with my love of the genre, and I really believe in heroic figures. I mean, morality is important to me. So anyway, that's just what I wanted to say about that, I guess.
I know we kind of need to kind of wrap things up here, but Brady, let me come back to you for any final thoughts on any of that sort of thing.
Well, yeah, no, I'm always struck by Grant's the idea of the hero and morality that seems so out of place in our world. I value that in Grant's work and Grant's view of the world so much. And I guess for my last comment for the day, the blending, I think, of the literary and those genres that we love. It seems like Ted just said, that that's kind of what we do. And so, I mean, aren't we kind of lucky? I mean, aren't we really kind of fortunate that we get to bring some different kinds of passions together and hopefully make something that is interesting and engaging for folks to read.
Right. Hey, we kind of left the story hanging. The only thing I want to say about it is it has a surprise ending. And so I very much encourage our listeners to track down a copy of issue 26 of Sand Magazine, Sand Journal, and read that story for yourself and read what Brecken Blakesley does. Beautifully and surprisingly, shockingly at the end of this little story, and read the rest of the journal while you're at it. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead.
I just want to add real quickly too, two things. The story's kind of got some experimental components, but it does have that classics. It has a turn that I kind of expect in literary fiction, and it works beautifully in this piece. And it's kind of a callback, but I'm not going to say anything more than that. But I did not expect it, but at the same time, it's totally earned in a kind of classical sense. And I love this story. So to track it down, read this. It's great.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thank you guys. I really enjoyed our talk, obviously, since we've gone on and on here, but I'll get this posted. I appreciate our listeners and our viewers, and we will see you, down the road sometime next month. I'm going to hit stop record.